Okay, so in the last lecture, we saw why Rawls would say healthcare is a right, right? It's not as easy, not as direct as it might seem, but I think there is a good case, for thinking that this real equality of opportunity principle would require a right to healthcare. You know, simply for the reasons that, you know, being sick gets in the way of opportunity even when we think of jobs. Having to rely on health insurance from our work does too, but also because I think Sen is right, and that if we really go with the logic of the original position, we should think of equality of opportunity more broadly than just being able to succeed at a job, right? You know, work is not life. We would probably want to think of life more generally. And when it comes to having a decent life, access to healthcare can be very, very important. In fact, it will be very important for pretty much all of us if we live long enough, right? Even if we're super lucky in the rest of life, you hit middle age, and even more especially old age, things start to break, right? Metaphorically and really. Okay, but let's move on to Nozick. Does anyone want to guess what Nozick is going to say about whether healthcare is a right? I'll let you out of suspense. If you've been paying attention at all, you shouldn't have been in suspense. But anyway, Nozick will say no. Healthcare is not a right. Nozick will say the government, the state, has no business meddling in making sure people have health care. That is not a thing it should do. Remember, for Nozick, the whole point, the only thing that the government is allowed to do, he sums up with this idea of the night watchman state, right? The government should protect our physical persons and our property. It should protect our persons and property from other people, right? It should keep other people from assaulting us or breaking or stealing our property. That's all it should do. Making sure that we get health care is not under that umbrella. Why does Nozick say this? Well, again, just think of his basic approach, right? Rawls and Sen will say, well, look, it's really unfair if one person is sick and doesn't have the same chances because they're sick and can't access health care that someone in better health or someone with better access to health care has. It's unfair some people have worse health than others, and it's unfair that some people can afford to pay for good health care and others can't. But again, Nozick would just say, well, look, yeah, in a very real sense, that's not fair. But that doesn't mean that the lucky person is obligated to help the unlucky one, right? If the lucky person isn't the reason that the unlucky person is doing badly, if she hasn't caused it in some way, then why does she have any moral obligation, any duty to help the unlucky person? If the healthy person or the person who can afford health care, if they've done nothing to cause the other person to be sick or unable to pay for health care, well, it might be nice of them to help them, but why do they owe them, right? And Nozick would say, taxing people to help so that other people can have access to health care, that's just nothing more than indirectly forcing those people to help others. And you need to explain why those other people have a claim to their help, and Nozick will say you haven't. You, Rawls, and Sen have not done that, he will say. All right. One interesting little aside here, and this isn't directly relevant to the question of, you know, access to healthcare. I mean, I guess it is in one sense, but it's not directly relevant to whether the government should pay. But when we talk about access to healthcare, we might talk about drugs being too expensive, right? Is it unjust, unfair, or otherwise wrong for drug companies to charge a huge price for life-saving drugs that some people can't afford? Nozick would say no. It is not unfair. He would say that drug companies should be free to charge whatever they want for the drugs they invent. If Omnicorp invents a cure for cancer tomorrow morning and it, chooses to charge $500 million for the cure to cancer and most people can't get it and all these people who die from cancer could have been cured, Nozick would say that's a lousy thing to do maybe, but the company shouldn't be forced to price it so that these people could afford it. Well, why not? Nozick would say this, right? Well, what was going to happen to all the people with cancer before Omnicorp developed the cure for cancer? Some of them would have been cured by current treatments. Well, maybe Omnicorp's thing is quicker, but without Omnicorp, they would have had the same fate. They would have lived through their cancer, right? Well, the other people who are going to die from cancer, well, Nozick would say, well, what would have happened if Omnicorp hadn't invented the cure to cancer? Well, these people would have died anyway. Omnicorp isn't making them worse off by not pricing the cure to cancer at a price they can afford, because if Omnicorp hadn't discovered the cure for cancer, these people would have died anyway. The same goes for other treatments, more realistic ones, right? If the company discovers it, if it creates it, then the company doesn't make you worse off by not pricing it at a price you can afford, because if they hadn't invented it, you wouldn't have had access to this treatment anyway, right? What the company is doing in these cases, Nozick would say, is refusing to help, giving you the drug at a price you can afford rather than harming. Someone harms you when they do something that makes you worse off than you would have otherwise been. If someone puts arsenic in your drinking water and, arsenic causes cancer over time and you develop cancer because the arsenic in your drinking water, low levels will do this, well, then that person has harmed you. They probably do owe you something, even by Nozick's lights, right? In fact, Nozick would say they certainly owe you something. But if the company invents the cure to cancer and just doesn't give it to you at a price you can afford, well, they didn't cause the cancer, or whatever other health condition we think of, they didn't cause it. They're not the reason people are sick, so they haven't harmed anyone. What they're doing is refusing to help by giving people drugs at a price they can afford. And Nozick will say, think back to this distinction that was important in the abortion debate and with physician-assisted suicide, letting something happen rather than doing, right? If you do something, something happens because of your actions that wouldn't have happened if you weren't in the picture. If someone pushes somebody off of a pier into the water, well, that person wouldn't be drowning if the person who pushed them hadn't been there, right? But if somebody just falls into the water and somebody happens to just be standing there, well, that person would have presumably still fallen in the water if not for the bystander. The bystander's just over there staring at his phone, doing nothing. Person slips on a banana peel. Bystander's not the one who puts it there. He hasn't done anything. Things would have still played out the same way had he not been there, right? And Nozick would say, if someone poisons your drinking water, they've done something. You wouldn't have developed whatever disease if they hadn't done this. But if they just refuse to give you the cure that they've invented, they haven't done anything to you, because if they were gone, the same thing would still happen. You would die of whatever disease, right? So refusing to provide the drug at prices people can afford is letting them suffer from their conditions, maybe die, rather than doing anything, rather than killing them. Or so says Robert Nozick. Now, all this gets complicated because, in the real world, the government actually does do a lot to help drug care companies develop their drugs. Universities play a big role. As always, things are more complicated because in the real world, you would think, well, all that help maybe means drug companies have a bit more in the way of obligation to give the public drugs at prices they can afford. But if they just invented it on their own, then Nozick would say, well, look, no obligation here. Now, one thing that gets super complicated for Nozick, and I think throws a huge wrinkle in his whole philosophy, are pandemics. Now, it's interesting Gawande mentions this in the article, right? Thomas Jefferson was very much, suspicious of government power. I think in a lot of ways Jefferson might have been sympathetic to some of what Nozick says. I don't know. I unlike the dude who always pops up on the radio, I make no claim to being able to read the mind of Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if you guys ever hear that show. I hate it so much, the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I mean, A, Jefferson is not God. B, I don't know why this Clay Jenkinson dude thinks he can peer into the mind of Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, if you've never listened to it, it's a show on public radio. It just annoys me to no end. Anyway, back to my point. My point is, as Gawande mentions, Jefferson is very suspicious of government power, but when it comes to a smallpox epidemic, he thinks the government should step in and make sure people are immunized. Nozick says nothing about this, but I think it creates a real problem for Nozick. Well, why is that? Well, think about what happens during a pandemic. Other people catch a disease, and you are in danger of catching it because they have it. A disease that might harm your health or kill you. Well, Nozick says, well, look, the government should protect us from other people harming our property and person. If another person gives, somebody smallpox or, COVID, that seems to harm them, right? If the government should protect people from being harmed by other people on Nozick's logic, well, then shouldn't the government do something to stop a pandemic? I think Jefferson, despite his limited government ideas, is consistent about this, making sure people have vaccines protects them from this danger other people pose to them. It does seem that even on Nozick logic, even on this libertarian logic, that's a legitimate thing for government to do. And it seems that maybe taking other measures to slow or stop transmission, to keeping other people from threatening your person by the fact they have a disease, it seems even on libertarian grounds like Nozick's, that's legitimate. Mask mandates, probably on Nozick's logic, legitimate, right? And this seems to open up the door for a lot of stuff the government could do in the name of pandemic prevention or ways to slow it down, right? Now, I will mention that libertarians, Nozick died a few years ago, he didn't see this. Libertarians who are sympathetic to Nozick see this, and they are terrified by it. Reason Magazine, one of the libertarian magazines, has published article after article of COVID denialism, trying to say COVID's not that bad, because I think they sense that a really serious pandemic like smallpox or like COVID would open up the door, even on Nozickian or libertarian logic, to a lot more government intervention than they like. So Nozick wouldn't say that there's a right to health care. And I don't think he would like saying that the government should take an active role in distributing vaccines or preventing pandemics, but I think the logic of his own position pushes him very strongly towards that. Okay, so to wade right into current events, even on Nozick logic, I think the government, maybe there's not a right to health care full stop, the government should definitely have a role in preventing diseases that can spread, especially pandemics that are deadly. All right, Anderson's kind of an afterthought here, but I had you guys read her. I think I should say a little bit about her philosophy. I think Anderson, it's not clear how hers applies to healthcare, but I do think, the fact that we rely on our employers for health insurance does make it easier for them to dominate us, right? Makes it, even as we see in Gawande's article, makes it harder for people to quit. I think that would be a reason Anderson would say the government should do something to provide for the basics of healthcare. Anyway, sorry to talk a whole lot about Nozick and just an afterthought on Anderson, but I think there's a lot more to be said on this with Nozick than there is with, say, Anderson.